The last time I spoke at NDC was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And then I went and I lived in the US. Because everybody has to live in the US for at least a couple of years. It's just a part of learning. So I went and I lived in Silicon Valley for a couple of years. Worked in some of the biggest companies. Had some major learnings. And we all know that learning comes from failure. So I learned a lot. Okay. And a lot of this talk is going to be based on what I've learned in those huge companies and how we can apply it. So actually, before we start, how many people here work at a fairly large company? Fairly large is 1,000 people and above. Okay? 10,000 and above? Okay? 50,000 and above? Okay, just one person. Where do you work? Schlumberger. Okay, I know Schlumberger. It's the egg, right? I'm just kidding. That's Fabergé. By the way, these are my jokes. I'm sorry. Okay, so this talk is going to be based on a lot of the things that I learned the hard way, and working as a consultant in some of the largest companies in the world, from Bank of America, AIG, Siemens. And in all of them, one of the jobs that we had is to try to implement any type of continuous delivery or DevOps, but not at a team scale, but enterprise scale. So this talk is going to be about all the things we learned the hard way. A little bit about where I come from. My name is Roy Osherove. I've been in the software industry for about 20 years. I wrote a couple of books on unit testing and elastic leadership. I'm currently writing a third book on enterprise DevOps because that's what I do. I work for a few years, and then I write for a few years, and then I work for a few years. I'm just finishing the working part. And one of the things that always bothered me is that after I wrote The Art of Unit Testing, it was pretty successful, and I went around and I did talks. And every year, the talks would always be the same. It would always be about the basics of unit testing. And every company I would go to would talk about the basics of unit testing and how to get going. And every time, the struggle would stay the same. Everyone would always be at the same point. Since this book came out, I'm still doing a lot of that. So many companies want to do, for example, unit testing or test-driven development, and they are bringing me or other people in to train, and they're trying to change things, and things have not changed. People are still struggling, and most people are still not doing it. And this was very, very frustrating, because when you teach something, you expect the level to go higher over the years. And so far, there has been a higher level, but only in a very, very small subset of companies that I visited. And I started thinking, why isn't it working? Why isn't a perfectly good idea that we know is perfectly logical, that makes a lot of sense, such as unit testing, right? We all agree that unit testing is a good idea, but yet still so many places and organizations don't do it. And that's where I started looking into the idea of leadership, and how does leadership actually take effect in this and actually make a change. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about influence forces and how to actually get people to change their behavior. And to me, enterprise DevOps is kind of a combination of the two skill sets. It's not about just unit testing, but it definitely is. DevOps and pipelines are all a form of testing in a way. But the ability to change an organization is a core skill that connects these dots together. So when we look at the challenges that we have in an enterprise DevOps, well, we're talking about the word enterprise. It used to mean such a beautiful thing, enterprising young man, a beautiful enterprise, something beautiful that you're building. But here in the software development world, enterprise is kind of a bad word. It's kind of like, oh no, I work in an enterprise. So in your head, automatically everything becomes cumbersome and monolithic and interdependent, and many approval gates. And all these things come to life in our heads when we say enterprise, because that is the reality we live in, is that the bigger the organization, the more combinations of approval gates and compliance and dependencies come into play. So this talk will be about these challenges and how to try to solve them. But first, I just want to say that this talk will probably not make any difference in your life whatsoever. I apologize in advance. It's very likely that you're going to this conference and you're going to all these talks, and you're learning all these skills, and then you're going to come back to your company and you're going to say, well, we should definitely do this, and we should definitely do that, and we should definitely try this, and then nothing will change in your company. Everyone will say, yeah, that's cool, now get back to work. And that is the reality that we face. That's the reality that I face every day as well, is what happens with the ideas that we have in our head that we know that are good, and actually making them happen in reality. And this is exactly why I think that before we talk about how to make change in an enterprise DevOps situation in a big company, we have to understand how to actually make that change happen, regardless of what it is we're trying to change. And this is the idea of influence forces. And this has worked for me in many situations. So I think this is the core skill that we want to get out of this talk right now. Now, this talk will focus first on the idea of influence forces, and then once we understand it, I'm going to look at the enterprise challenges I mentioned just before, and I'm going to put each one as which influence forces affect it and how can we actually change it. So we'll have a common language on how to approach a specific problem. Okay? Now, when we understand the influence forces, we can understand why people do what they do. I'll explain. There's a book that I'm gonna say the name of, but in that book, one of the key phrases is, for any behavior that you see a person doing or not doing, the world around that person is perfectly designed for that behavior to happen, right? So if you were in that person, if you were in their shoes, if you had their family, if you had their boss, if you had their kids, their pets, their school, their education, their job security, or their experience, you would have done the exact same thing as they would have done. And that's what we need to understand, is that usually people do want to do the right thing, but there are many things that influence their behavior other than just wanting to do the right thing. So once we understand those influence forces, we can look at the situation and not feel stumped, because this happened to me many times, right? You teach people unit testing, and you understand that they want to do it, and still nothing happens. And you say, well, I have no idea what to do now. I give up. Because what else could there be other than it logically makes sense and the person knows how to do it? And once we understand it, we can map those challenges to what we're trying to change into which influence forces we want to affect. And this is the book that I want to talk about. It's called Influencer. And the book talks about many different ways to change behavior in very small groups and in also very large groups. And it talks about 6 influence forces. But before we talk about them, when we try to understand a behavior that we see, first of all, we find a symptom. We see something we want to change in the organization, right? We look for something like, releases take a long time. We discover the root cause of that using usually 5 whys. Which is asking why 5 times. I know it sounds weird and silly, but releases take a long time. Why? Because, let's say, testing takes a long time. Why does testing take a long time? Because it's manual. Why is it manual? Because we never got a budget, etc. So a lot of times, 5 whys will get you to a specific root cause, and that is the thing that we're trying to change. And the root cause usually has a behavior that we want to change. For example, maybe at the root of all this, there is a specific, let's say, manager that approves or doesn't approve a budget for something. And that is the thing that we want to change. It's not the symptom, it's the root cause. And once we understand that what is the root behavior, we describe it. It has to be something physical. Something physical means something that you can actually measure. Because if I go to an organization and I say, we want to change the releases because everything is slow, that's not something that you can measure. You have to measure something very specific. The person either arrives or doesn't arrive on time. The release has more than X amount of bugs in production. The time it takes to recover is at least this amount of time. That's something that we can measure. We can say Booleanly, true or false. Have we actually managed to change that thing? For example, when the team requests permission to change the pipeline, the IT admin says, nope. We want to change the pipeline. No, I'm sorry. that's a different team. And in large organizations, that's a very common pattern, is that the team that does the development is separate from the team that does the deployment into production. And sometimes it's for compliance reasons, sometimes it's just because the way things are done. But if we want the team to have the ability to do continuous delivery, they have to be able to control the pipeline. So that is an example of a behavior we might want to change. When a release milestone arrives, the tech lead announces a code freeze. Okay, that's a problem. But how do we avoid this, right? How do we change this behavior? Why do they do the code freeze? Because they're afraid of introducing new bugs. Well, maybe feature flags can help, etc. There are many different ways to accomplish changing a behavior. When the build fails, nobody in the team does anything about it. I don't know if this has happened to you, but I've been on teams where the build has failed for days, and everyone just goes, yep, definitely fails. I'm sure someone is doing something about it. And then at some point, nobody pays attention to the build. Nobody trusts the build anymore. So these are examples of, their core behaviors in a specific team, but if we want to change them across teams in the entire organizations, what are the reasons that those behaviors happen? And once we understand, maybe we can start changing it. Because just looking at a team and saying, we should all start doing this, doesn't actually work. I mean, maybe it would work 1% of the time. But usually there are good reasons why people are not doing it. Because people are not malice. They're not thinking of doing harm to the project on purpose. Nobody is. Unless they just got fired, of course. Okay. So here are the 6 factors of influence that I gleaned from the book that I feel are really, really important to understand. Because we usually, when we try to understand why people do or don't do something, we usually look only at the first 2. The personal motivation of the person, what do they want to do, what do they dislike doing, what do they think is a good idea or a bad idea. That's kind of convincing a person. And personal ability. Is the person actually able to do the tasks that we expect them to do? If it was unit testing, then it's about writing good unit tests. If it was about managing the pipeline on your own without having an IT admin doing it, do they have the knowledge to do it? Do they have the ability to type on a keyboard? Do they have, I know it sounds weird, but sometimes we don't consider that there are behaviors that we think people are always able to do, and sometimes they're not. It sounds weird, but I know programming, keyboard is usually 99% of the time is an ability. But then there is social motivation and social ability, right? The social motivation and social ability, well, let me explain it this way. In a personal motivation, we say, does the person believe in something? In ability, is the person physically able to do it? In a group of motivation, we're saying, does the person follow others who spread bad behavior? For example, if there's an architect on my team, and people are asking me to do, let's say, unit testing. And the architect on my team thinks unit testing is a horrible idea. And I trust that person. I've been following that person for a long time. I really trust their advice. So if the people that I follow, the people that I trust, think it's a good idea or a bad idea, it makes a difference on my behavior. So even though I might think it's a good idea, if the people that I follow think it's not a good idea, it definitely might change my behavior. So for example, in an organization where if I'm going to an organization and I tell a person, I go to a team and I say, I notice you only have nightly builds. What if we did multiple builds a day, right? So the person is a developer. Maybe the developer doesn't have a lot of knowledge about automated builds yet, et cetera. But then the DevOps person in the room, which is usually the person responsible around for the team in large organizations, if that person goes in and says, what do you need that for? Right? If the DevOps person, the operations person goes in and says, what do you need that for? And the developer is in the room while I'm talking to the developer, and the developer trusts the DevOps person, the developer is going to say, well, I don't know this person, but I definitely know that person. And that person I've worked with for 2 years, and they've been helping me out with all of my pipeline needs. Obviously, that person knows what they're talking about, so if they think it's not a good idea, why would I think it's a good idea? So then, before I actually go and talk to the developer, what I need to do is I need to have a talk with the DevOps people so that when I do talk to the developers, there's going to be an agreement on what are the values so that there's a good handshake between us so that we both come up with the same message. Because otherwise, what's going to happen is that they're going to see mommy and daddy are fighting, right? Oh, the DevOps consultant is saying X, but our DevOps people are saying Y. And again, I trust these people much more. So before I talk to the people, I have to go around and talk to the people that will talk to the people. And that's an example of an influence force. The second thing is ability. Ability is how do people react when you actually do a specific behavior. For example, if a person is working on a build and they're the only ones and they don't share information about how the build works. And they could work on it, 2 in the morning, 5 in the morning, because the build fails and they're like the heroes in the team. If that person is not willing to share information, how do people react when that person is not willing to share? If people say, hey, let's work on this together, and that person says no. And if people react by saying, okay, and nobody ever challenges that person about it, then basically they're enabling this behavior, right? If no one ever says, well, actually, I think it's a good idea that we do pair. Or the other way around, if a person is trying to do something like work on a specific pipeline, et cetera, and other people are saying, why are you working on this? We have much more important things to do, then that person will very likely stop doing that thing, even though they believe it's a good idea. And the third level is company. What rewards does the company provide, or what punishment does the company provide for a specific behavior? For example, how are people measured? What is the success definition of your role? In a DevOps world, operations many times are measured, the metrics that they're based on are stability. And stability, what's the best way to achieve stability in production? Does anyone know? Sorry? No change, exactly. And what are developers being pushed to do every day? Change as much as possible. Continuous delivery, deploy multiple times a day. And then the operations people are sitting there with shields like Captain America in their hands going, you shall not pass. Because if I let this pass, it will lead to stability problems. And I get less money at the end of the year if there's less stability. So I don't care that you're supposed to do X. I'm supposed to do the opposite of that. So just by the way that the company measures a specific role, we can create these conflicting requirements. And one of the things that usually happens is that those metrics are one of the first things we want to start changing. Because at the company level, a lot of times the management looks at those metrics as one of the most important things. Okay. And this is the example, this is how it appears in the book, because we want to actually change those influence forces. We want to, for example, make the undesirable desirable. We want to make things either more fun, more interesting, more attractive. We want to make things more possible from a personal motivation standpoint. We want the people to surpass their limits. We want them to learn new things. From a social standpoint, we want to harness peer pressure. So for example, if there are people doing unit testing or TDD in the organization, and there's just not many of them, one of the best ways to get them together, to have like an internal meetup of people who think this is a good idea. And then it's like Alcoholics Anonymous. I know that my team thinks it's a horrible idea, but I know at least 5 people in the organization, and we meet once a month, and we talk about how difficult it is to push this stuff in the organization, but we support each other, right? So in one hand, could be positive, which is strength in numbers if I'm not alone. On the other hand, we can also influence other people by creating peer pressure to say, I'm not the only one who thinks we should change this. There are all these other people who think we should change this, and then you can go to a manager and say, there is a significant movement of people in this organization who think this should change. And in terms of company, we want to design the rewards and create accountability for the right things. And we want to change the things that are hurting the organization. The last but not least is the physical environment in which we work. Right? The physical environment is, are you physically able to accomplish the right behavior at the company level? For example, if we want people to do pair programming, but all the tables are these corner tables, right? There's room for one person, and the table goes like this, right, as a corner table. how can you do pair programming on a table like that? You actually have to have a person sitting right at the edge of the table looking like this. Can you turn the screen a little bit? It's very, very uncomfortable. We want it to be comfortable. For DevOps and builds related, it could be budget for having private or public cloud. It could be having enough servers, enough resources. It could be physically having rules that allow doing something. For example, policies that allow deploying to production, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to remember that this influence, this set of influences is just a checklist. It's not a recipe. That is, whenever I go to a specific problem and I say, I think we're stuck here, in my head, I might create this kind of checklist. I'm not going to go to a person and say, what's your social motivation here, right? The person could look at me and say, please go get out. I'm trying to work. But if I start to investigate things kind of like Sherlock Holmes, I say, why is that person reluctant to achieve this specific behavior, right? What is pushing them to do this? For example, I had a big discussion between two groups in a major company with over 200,000 employees, right, in that company. And in that company, there was an IT organization and a DevOps organization and a development organization. And development would always ask DevOps for resources, and DevOps would open a ticket to the IT, and then IT would get back and say, okay, we will allow it, and then after a week or two, it would come back and they would get the resource, which would be a virtual machine, for example. So I had a discussion. I created a meeting just to have a first conversation with the IT administrator and the DevOps administrator, just to see where can we make things faster, more understandable. And there was a lot of reluctance from the IT administrator to even talk about this, right? So I wanted to understand what are they afraid that's going to happen? What is the influence force here? So I said, what if instead of DevOps opening the ticket directly, why don't we let the developers open the ticket with you directly? Why do they have to go through DevOps? He says, no, never going to happen. I say, okay, that's interesting. Why? He said, because then we will never be able to handle the amount of calls we're going to get. The DevOps are filtering all the calls for us, and that way we get enough that we can actually do it because our team is too small. If our team is too small and we get hundreds of requests and we do everything manually, then we will never be able to do it. And that's an interesting observation, because then we can say, okay, so right now, even if we created a policy that says developers can contact IT, IT will fight us every step of the way, because IT is not equipped. They're not physically able. This is personal ability, right? Physically able, but also structural ability. They don't have enough resources to actually handle, and they don't have the skill in terms of knowledge how to automate it, because if they were able to automate it, then they could handle a much bigger load. And if they can handle a much bigger load, we can open the floodgates. So all these things are connected to each other. So before we actually make a change to a policy, we have to go and start teaching the group about automation and about the ability to automate it, and then create this kind of scale. And once we have the scale, we can create this, we can start to drop things in the middle, and maybe we can even get rid of the entire ticketing system. Maybe the team will be able to create a cloud that has a private API. But now I'm dreaming, okay? This is a big organization. We're talking about changes that could take from months to sometimes years. But we have to know where we're targeting. So it's more of a checklist. If I don't understand something, I start thinking, what am I missing? What am I not asking? And then I just look back at this, and for my own notes, I say, okay, I think there might be this, there might be this. Which brings us to enterprise challenges. So in enterprise challenges, we have all these things: interdependency, monolithics, approval gates, compliance. And mostly, I would say that the challenges fall into structural ability and structural motivation. That is, most of the time in large companies, the things that are stopping us from making the changes are the way people are measured, the way that the policies in the company exist, what rules there are. The reasons for the policies are usually because they don't know a lot of different things. There are many ways to change it. And sometimes it's the physical environment of the organization. I was once in an organization where we were in a company that purchased 4 other companies. And each of the companies was in a completely different location with a completely different network, right? And completely different source control. And they had to integrate into the same product. So every build of the product, the full build, integration build of the entire groups as a set was once every 3 months, right? Once every 3 months there was a build just to compile. Okay, if you can imagine, people were sending each other like DLLs in email. That's how difficult that was, right? And we were moving them into having a nightly build. But how do you get a nightly build if you're on a completely different network? So sometimes it's a physical ability. They actually have to create an Ethernet line connecting the areas, which were luckily at the same state. But it took basically 6 months just to create the physical hardware that would enable a nightly build, just to get the sources, just to get the latest version. That's an example of where those policies are. Sometimes we think these are true, but they're not true. We think that this is a structural problem, but it's not. For example, I was in an organization where I was supposed to be helping people write unit tests, and nobody was writing unit tests, but there were some unit tests, but nobody was writing new ones. And I said, why aren't you writing unit tests? And said, well, nobody ever runs the unit tests. Why would we even write them? So I went to the build group, and I said, why aren't you running the unit tests? And they said, well, 700 tests are failing, and nobody's fixing them. I said, okay, that makes sense. I wouldn't run those tests either. So then we went back to the group, and I said, okay, we need to fix those tests. And said, but if we fix them, will they actually run them? So I went back and said, if we fix them, will you run them? I said, well, maybe. I said, no, we have to run them. I said, well, why would you create a nightly build if no one will ever use it? Why would they even care? Because they don't really care about the quality. And then I said, no, we have to build it so that we can enable them to use it. And then it's my job to kind of get them to start using the pipeline. So then we fixed the unit test, and we got the unit test working in the pipeline. And the pipeline ran as a nightly build. And everyone was so surprised that everyone wanted to look at the results that the build was actually running. And people started writing unit tests. Again, it wasn't like the most perfect. Everyone was running, and there was unicorns in the air, and everyone was, haha, I'm writing unit tests. No, there were still other problems. But at least now there was a mandate. There was a reason to write. Because if you think, right, this is an example of personal motivation. If you think that nobody will ever look at the code that you wrote, no one will ever run it, there is no motivation for you to even write that code, right? What's the point? And in many organizations, people write code, and they feel like they're sending it into a black hole, and maybe in 2 months they're going to get back some kind of feedback on code that they already forgot that they wrote. So what motivation is there to do the best that you can, to even refactor, to do the thing that you want to do when you feel like you're sending this code off to Never Never Land? So one of the key things that I like doing is to have this visualization, right? Literally put up a screen where the team is sitting. Even though the team gets emails from builds that happen, having a screen that shows red, green, and how what you're doing here actually affects the screen there is a psychological effect. It does create personal motivation that you want to change it. You come in and you say, you know, I noticed the build has been running for an hour and a half. Maybe we can make it faster. Conversations that you would never have done if you don't have that kind of visibility, even though you get the emails. The emails are usually kind of worthless. They're just for specific problem, but they're not root cause. Okay, so that was the spiel just for the beginning. So if DevOps is changed, right? If my idea of DevOps is that we treat infrastructure just like we treat software development. We treat everything as code, everything also has tests, and the organization becomes a pipeline-based organization. Everything runs through a pipeline. And a pipeline is basically a series of tests. That's what it is. Compilation test, unit test, integration test, security test, compliance test. They're all just tests. If you pass a pipeline, you've just passed a huge test. That's all it is. So in a pipeline organization, in a DevOps organization, everyone becomes a tester, and everyone becomes a coder. Even people who never wrote code before should start learning to code. But that's a huge change, right? Imagine people who've been doing operations for 20 years, and now we're saying, well, no longer will you just do X. Now you will do X plus Y plus Z, because that is the new way of working. And we feel that this way is going to be much better. That's a very scary thought, especially if we're saying we're going to automate a lot of what you're doing today manually. Well, what am I going to do now? If you're going to automate all my work, what am I supposed to do? Now, the answer is there's a lot to do. There's so much that you can do other than just working on everyday problems. You can start thinking at a meta level on how to automate pipelines throughout the organization. You can become a coach and teach other people how to work with pipelines. You can start learning new technologies instead of being stuck in old technologies. You can start learning and transforming yourself. But this transformation is difficult. There are so many ways to accomplish it. So I'm going to cover on some of the anti-patterns that organizations do that usually fail, that I've seen. And the first one, big bang transformation. And the idea is that in the leadership's head, it would say, okay, I'm going to hire these consultants, and they're going to start here, and in a year, we're going to be there, and then we're done with our DevOps transformation. Hooray to everybody, champagne. And of course, when they say that to all the middle management and the technical leads, everyone goes, yeah, absolutely. We should definitely be able to do that. We think it's a great idea. It will definitely succeed. And then management whips the flag, and they say, okay, go. And everyone just starts going at it. Okay, you do the pipeline, and you do that stuff. Oh, wait, I need permission to do that. No, you can't. You don't have permission. No, but my manager said this. No, but you cannot. Okay, so we're stuck. And everyone just goes back to panic mode, and they basically abort a lot of those changes. And a lot of times this happens because we're trying to, someone said nicely, boil the ocean. We're trying to make too much change at the same time. So we're creating all these conflicting environments at the same time. It's much better to create mini versions of change. And in these mini versions, imagine that we're creating these small pilot applications. We're taking just parts of the teams, and we are learning what does it mean to do continuous delivery at our organization. Every organization is different. And look at how many of the influence forces this touches, this changes, right? In terms of, because we need to learn how do we do continuous delivery. At the very basic level, it's about new skill. At the social level, it's about having people that support you when you're learning the new skill. So we have to create a team of people who are all targeted at the same idea. Not the entire organization, but a team of people. Because structurally, if you took the entire organization, you're basically halting development, and then you're getting pressure on you're basically losing money every day by slowing everything down to a halt, and you're creating huge risk for the organization, which the organization does not tolerate. In large organizations, this is a huge problem. So we want to affect all of these influences by saying, okay, not all the organization, and if we want to learn skill, we're going to do it incrementally. So we're going to create a pilot team. And this pilot team its designation is going to be do a continuous delivery, including deployment to production in this organization, and it has to be a product that feels real, not something that is made up, but something that does end up in production every day, or you're already in production, that has some risk, but not too much risk. It's kind of like somewhere in the middle. And this team is going to be made out of people from all walks of life, right? From operations to compliance to security, because we have no idea what does it take to go from X to Y. We have no idea what are the requirements, because if you mapped out how many regulations and compliance and forms and committees you have to go through to go to production in large companies, sometimes we're talking about hundreds of requirements just to go through, which can take months. So this pilot team has many prerogatives that other teams do not. So from structurally, we're saying you're allowed to do things that other people are not allowed. You're allowed, for example, to use public cloud with these specific compliance requirements. Or you're allowed to use private cloud, but you can create VMs as much as you want instead of opening a ticket. You're allowed to do a bunch of other things depending on what the pipeline requires. So that's one way to start approaching it. The second version of this is that we're making these, but only a part of the organization is committed to the change. And I've seen this as well. Either the technical side is pushing for a change and leadership is not ready, or leadership is pushing for a change and the technical side is not ready. So in our case, what we want is to have bidirectional support. That means that when we're trying to implement change, it cannot be just technical. If it's just technical, we're creating another bubble in the organization, and that bubble is getting farther away from how the organization reacts. And I've seen this countless times in huge organizations, is that people invite me and they'll say, don't tell anyone, but we have our own private pipeline here. We can do whatever we want. We can do this and run all these things. And I used to be a proponent of this idea. We do this all, but what happens then? They can only do it up until a specific point. Then the wall has to break. They can't actually get to production or to staging environments. And what happens when they have to leave the bubble? Now the other part of the organization that already feels neglected and left out and nobody talks to them and hides information from them. And now this team has to basically integrate with a part that's even farther away than they were before. And now that part is also, doesn't like the group as well. So not only do you have bad integration, you might also have bad intentions at this point. Because the procedures here and the procedures there are completely different. There was no understanding that we want to have the same thing. So we want, while we work with technical people, to also work with leadership and to actually make it accountable, make them accountable to support each other. Because if we break the bubble and we say we want to continue doing this all the way here, and here this whole side says, I don't know what you're talking about. No one ever told me this is allowed. Talk to my manager, but I have no idea. So you're still going to have to go through the proper channels, which sometimes horribly means recompiling the code and deploying manually and testing manually, even though we have huge pipelines that already did all these things automatically, just because we didn't talk to people on the other side. Why didn't we talk to people on the other side? Because in our head, a lot of times we create this fake conversation that says, they'll never agree to it. When I know exactly what they're going to say. No, you don't. This is our internal voice preventing us from doing something difficult, which is to have a conversation with a person that might not agree with you, that might challenge you about something. But if you agree it's a good idea, you will have to come up with the right reasons how this can actually affect change. And if that person disagrees with you, we go back to the influence forces. We say, why does that person disagree even though it makes a lot of sense? Right? How is that person measured compared to what we're trying to do? Maybe if we go and we say, the way we're measuring it, it creates this tension in the organization, and so that person is unwilling to work with me. It's not that that person thinks that I'm a horrible person. They have a good reason. If I was them, maybe I wouldn't do it either, because I'm under the same type of pressure, same type of metrics, same type of anything. And that is the key understanding, is that we want to bring other people from other sides, and it's scary, but now we have a checklist that we can go through so that we can start breaking down these barriers when we come upon a no. When someone says no, we have to understand why that no happens. Not just that person doesn't care, that person doesn't like. Not true at all. That person probably cares sometimes even more than we care. Maybe that person has even more history, and if we knew it, maybe we could come up with a solution that we both care about, that we both agree on. And this is a lot of times happening in huge companies. People are afraid to talk to each other. And I will say that 50% of the time, people are surprised to find out that the person on the other side is actually happy and willing and has already started investigating it on their own. If we don't think that, that operations leadership is looking at DevOps and continuous delivery and trying to create their own solutions for it, and also not talking to all the development leads as well, we're wrong. It's usually happening in parallel. both of these teams are working on these solutions and they never talk to each other. So someone comes up with this and someone says, no, I already have a solution. But if we talk together, the solution would actually work for both sides. When either one works, it works only best for one side, but it doesn't take into account the problems of the other side. For example, measured by stability. A third thing that happens when we try to change an organization is that we don't change the policy. So remember that pilot team. And I said, well, in many organizations, you're not even allowed to deploy to production. And if you're not allowed to deploy to production, how are you ever going to do continuous delivery? I mean, you've already failed. And so part of a pilot team is not just understanding this pipeline, right? This is an example of an ideal pipeline. So on the top, we have a software development or application code. At the bottom, we have infrastructure code. And both of them go through a series of steps until one gets deployed on the other. And then we run a bunch of tests until we deploy to production. But in a DevOps organization that has compliance, we add one layer to that pipeline. And that layer is policy. Because we have to say, look, if we truly want to learn what it means to do continuous delivery in our organization, that we have to enable that pilot team that I discussed before, we have to enable them to do it. We have to create an exception in our policy. And that exception will only apply to that specific team, and it will be temporary, because we want to see what does it take to deploy to production, if that one team would allow it, would be allowed to do it. And so what's recommended, what I would recommend, and I've seen this happen, is to create what's called a tiger team. It doesn't matter what the name is, but a tiger team of compliance people in the organization. And the point of this team is to work with the development team, the pilot team, and to work with them on creating a policy, a compliance policy specifically for continuous delivery. A policy that allows continuous delivery, but still lives up to the standards of the organization. For example, it could say, if up to today, before you would go to production, there would be a person that manually checks that all of these documents are there, that all of these tests are passed, that all of this coverage exists, that all of these that security audit has passed, blah, blah, blah. All of these things, 99% of the time, these things can be automated. Not only can it be automated, it will give a better result because it's fully auditable. And if you build this automation step with the Tiger team, and the Tiger team says, yes, if this automated step that checks all these things passes, I'm okay with it. That's an example of compliance that you can put into the pipeline. So now the pipeline checks itself. And if the pipeline doesn't pass, then the pipeline doesn't pass. But if it does, then you can actually go to production. And again, this applies only to that single pilot team. But once we have this kind of special arrangement, and we've learned, sometimes it takes 3 months, sometimes it takes 5 weeks, sometimes it takes a year to get that thing. But once we've learned that it works for a specific team, we can start saying, okay, how do we take this thing that we learned and we apply this policy to other teams? Does it work for other teams? Let's do 1, 2, or 3 more pilots, and we'll see whether those policies that are allowed would allow that team to just go on and actually be productive much faster than the other team. Because we've already learned a lot. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can use existing pipelines. We can use existing policies, existing types of tests. So we can create a template of a pipeline with compliance built in. And we'll let another team try to use it and see where is the variance. And maybe after 2 or 3 teams, you can start having a generic idea of a pipeline. And you can say for different types of applications, different types of compliance. That's okay too. But if we don't even give it a try, we will never accomplish this. We will always be stuck in that type of organization. Okay. The second thing that, the third thing that we want to change is, what do we change? I know it sounds weird, but when you go to an organization and you have, let's say, 1,000 different applications in the organization, and you want to affect change, you want to do continuous delivery, you want to change things, because we know things would need to change. But what is the thing that needs to change? Where do we focus on first? What is the thing that is hurting us? what is the main metric of DevOps today of continuous delivery? One of the main metrics, one of 4, is cycle time. How long does it take me to get from an idea in the backlog at the company level to that idea being in production for a specific type of application? And if it could be weeks, could be months, could be years, we don't know. And once we understand this process, we can start looking at what do we want to optimize? Where's the problem? Because if you're coming into an organization, you don't know where the problems are. You don't know what is the right solution. And this is an example of what we call a value stream. Has anyone here ever tried to do a value stream in their company? Okay. Not a lot of people, and I think many people should be aware that this technique exists, and I highly recommend that you do it as basically a first step to almost any type of change relating to pipelines and continuous delivery. So a value stream basically is, imagine that I'm taking people from all around the organization, and people from development, from testing, from operations, from security, compliance, whatever it takes, project management, product owners. And for that specific product, I would say, okay, we're in a room together for the next, let's say, 3 hours. We're going to take sticky notes. We have a whiteboard. And we're just going to map out what does a requirement go through, right? If you took a GoPro camera and you put it on the forehead of a feature, right? A feature goes into the backlog. Okay, what does the feature see? Not what does the company see. The feature sees, okay, I'm put in the backlog, and then I wait there for about 3 weeks on average, and then someone picks me up. That seems to be the project manager. And then they do a high-level design. That takes about 1 day, and then I wait there until someone else picks me up. And then that takes me this, et cetera, et cetera. So from a point of view of a feature, what is the life of a feature in our organization? And we could say, it takes this amount of time, this amount of days. And what we want to measure is 2 numbers. We want to measure how long is the actual work, and how long is the calendar time. For example, I might wait for a day for someone to work on me. When they do work on the feature, it's 5 minutes of work, right? So calendar, I wait most of the time, and 5 minutes of actual work. So then I can measure what is the actual time of work on something versus waiting time. And this is a very important key understanding, is that the working time and actual time give us a lot of where the waste is, where is the thing that we're wasting time on. For example, in a sprint, I'm that single feature, remember. A single feature waits for the sprint to start, and then the feature, people start working on it, right? Now, we know for a fact that the feature, doesn't matter how long people work on it or how much people test it, it will always take, if the sprint is 2 weeks, the feature will take 2 weeks. Do we agree on that? The feature will take at least 2 weeks, might take more than 1 sprint, but it will never take less than 2 weeks. Doesn't matter how long people work on the feature, because we only deliver the feature at the end of the sprint. So at the sprint level, we would be working on multiple features and multiple pieces of code, but maybe on that specific feature, people will only work on for 2 or 3 days, and then it will be tested maybe just for 1 day. So the feature actual work time might be 4 days out of 10 days for a 2-week sprint. So then that's 6 days that feature could have been somewhere else, but it's waiting for the sprint to end. And this is where time boxing, starts to become almost a burden. If the team is happy with it, that's okay, but we have to know where's the waste. Why do we need to wait? Why not just release the feature when it's done? But we want to know about it. The same thing for how long does it take to deploy, and then I go through all these manual steps for deployment and verification and staging environment. It takes me a week to load up the staging environment, and then on average it breaks down at least twice, and then there's coming back. So how long does it take to deliver a feature? And that changes. But usually when I go through this, I'll take an Excel file like this, and this Excel file, for each project it changes, but I'll basically say, I'll put names of teams, basically handoffs, and for each column, I'll write down the names of the features being tested, the tasks being executed, and how long it takes in terms of days. And at the end, there's a tally of how many months, days, and weeks this takes. and almost always are the people in the room, because after about 3 hours, you're done mapping the structure, the flow. Usually people are surprised that it takes longer than they thought. Because a lot of times there's waiting, and even before you even start developing, there might be a huge piece of work. And even if we do continuous delivery here, most of the time might be even before we start development. So the reason for this value stream is that we want to understand where do we optimize first. If we want to affect change, we don't have to do everything at once. But maybe we affect the process of requirements first. Maybe we affect the process of deployment first. Maybe it's the testing. Maybe it's them in parallel. But we want to know what is our baseline. If our baseline is it takes us 6 months to deliver a feature from backlog to production, then now when we optimize, we can also measure ourselves based on this number. We can say, okay, after our work, it now takes 4 months, or it now takes 3 weeks to get to production. But now we have at least a metric that we can measure. Without something that we can measure, we won't know whether we're successful or not. Which brings us to metrics. So metrics, again, I said metrics can break a change in an organization, and they can make a change successful. Here is an example of a metric that can break successful adoption of continuous delivery in teams. So I've seen this. Management is saying, okay, we're all moving to continuous delivery. Let's measure how many red builds we get. Okay? Now, it might sound like what's the problem with that? But we have to understand that in the context of continuous delivery, a red build is not a bad thing. In continuous delivery, you might have many red builds, and every once in a while, you're going to have a green one. The red build is basically a feedback mechanism, just like a compiler, right? I want to compile as much as possible. In fact, I want my IDE to show me, even before I compile, that there's going to be a problem. So as I type, there's continuous compilation going on. I get feedback. The same thing for those builds. I want a red build because otherwise I won't know there's a problem. But if I measured on how many red builds I get, what's going to happen? It's the same problem as we said with stability with production. I'm going to be afraid to run builds. In fact, I'm going to be afraid to check in code because I'm going to be afraid to have a red build. And if I'm afraid to have a red build, I'm basically afraid of deploying source code. If I'm afraid of deploying source code, I'm going to have long-running branches. And I'm going to test all of them manually, maybe on the side. I'm going to be afraid there's going to be, basically, the code is going to wait much longer to be deployed because it's not even on the master branch. So I'm creating this kind of fear of people deploying code. When instead, what I want to do is I want to say it's okay. The second metric is the highest the coverage, the better you are. And I will be the first one to tell you is that coverage means, like 100% coverage means nothing. Okay, 10% coverage means something. 10% coverage means one thing. You know what it is? You're missing tests. 100% code coverage is meaningless unless you do a code review. And the code review actually looks at the tests. Because I've seen organizations measured by coverage, and then and as a consultant that also knows unit testing, people would bring me in and say, so listen, don't tell anyone, but we can get 10% more code coverage just by adding a loop in this test. It just goes through and just executes a bunch of methods on a class. We don't have to assert anything, but it will bring us the coverage. We can get, basically, like if the team lead comes in and says, okay, we have a hard requirement, we have to up the coverage to 80%. Everyone's going to go, we know what to do. And within a week, that team is going to get 80% code coverage. And those tests will be meaningless, okay, because we're measured on the wrong thing. So what we want to be measured is, I don't care how many reds you get. Right? I do want to see green every once in a while. And I don't trust your code coverage. I want to see that you do good code reviews. So as a manager, I want to see quality code, not quality coverage. High coverage with code review is good. High coverage with no code review is meaningless. So if I say that red builds are good, what do I measure instead? I like to measure from the first red to the first green. Okay? I don't measure how many reds I have. I measure how long it took me to get back to green. How long does it take a team to go from a red build to a green build? Why is that important? Because now I'm saying, I don't mind how many reds you have. What I mind is, what do you do when there is a red build? What is your behavior, right? Remember I said there are teams. One person was a saint and raised their hands 5 minutes before. Thank you. You get a free copy of RhinoMox. It's an open source. Okay, I will explain the jokes later. So what I will say in the last 5 minutes is that when a team does see a red build, what I want is for that behavior to change, remember? So this is an influence force. I said, because I can say then, I noticed that the time it takes for a red build actually becomes longer, and to get to a green build becomes longer and longer. What's going on there? And if I'm a manager, this actually affects the behavior. And it can affect the behavior for the better, because then I can say, if a red build happens, then the team should immediately do something about it, investigate it. And there are many ways to do it. Maybe assign a special sub-team of 1 or 2 people that are always responsible for the build status, and first investigation, and then moving to the appropriate developers who made the build broken. And those people can change every day. But everyone else can get back to just working on code, but there's always a first response, and there's always something being done to make the build green again. And so that is an example of something where I measure on a behavior that is very close to saying, instead of measuring stability, I'm going to measure mean time to recovery in production. It's the same type of idea. So these are the 4 metrics that are recommended in a DevOps world. Lead time to change, that is basically our cycle time. How long does it take a feature with a GoPro to go all the way to production? How many releases can we actually achieve? What is the release frequency? Does it change? Does it go up? Does it go down? What is the defect rate that we find in production, which should go down? And mean time to recovery instead of mean time to failure. So mean time to failure is stability, and mean time to recovery basically says, I don't care that production has failed. I care how long it takes to recover production. And that creates the opposite effect of what we said before. Because now if I measure all of the operations folks on how long does it take to recover a failed system in production, there's going to be much more work being done, and usually alongside the development organization, to achieve an application that is much easier to reload, or much easier to reconfigure, or much easier to deploy. For example, to investigate deployment patterns, such as blue-green, rolling deploys, et cetera, so that we have much less risk in deploying. And once we have less risk in deployment, we can enable much more change in deployment, which will allow us to basically open the floodgates. So this is an example of these 4 main metrics that we would like to change. Okay, one last thing, and then we're going to be done. One of the biggest anti-patterns, and everyone always says that, is that there is a DevOps team in your organization. Once you have a DevOps team in your organization, you've by definition created a bottleneck in the organization. You've said, these people are going to be working on everything that is build related, et cetera, and so all of you developers, you don't have to worry about it, which is the opposite of what we want to do. And so here's a set of values that I suggest that we implement in DevOps teams. If we are already in that situation, we can have a conversation with the DevOps team leads and say, what are our values as a DevOps team? And those values will bring about much better communication and much better collaboration with development teams. And there are 4 main value systems. We enable teams to control their own pipelines. So if I have to change the pipeline for development, I'm doing something wrong. Instead, what I want is I want to teach them. So we teach them to solve their own problems. If there's a problem with the pipeline, instead of fixing it on my own, I'll always fix it with someone else from development team next to me, Even better, I'll let them fix it and I'll sit next to them so that they learn this process. We embrace continuous delivery. We're not just operations folks anymore. We are talking about continuous delivery, so if we see something, we say something. If the team is going down the wrong path, we become coaches. We actually are coaching the team on what it means to have pipelines and continuous delivery. We want to get to faster builds, faster feedback loops. We want to parallelize things, and we'll teach them whatever they need to do, and we'll just create the infrastructure that the pipelines will run on. And lastly, we are part of the team. We're not sitting in our own room. We're sitting with the team. We're there in the daily. We're there in the iteration, in all the iteration meetings. We are there because in the new world, operations and development are part of the same stack. Everything is code. Everything is testing. And so we learn how to code if we don't code. We learn how to code the new pipelines if we've done it manually. Everything connects to that. Okay. So just to summarize, the first thing that we want to do to actually make change happen in huge organizations is we have to understand influence forces. Once we understand influence forces, for anything that we want to change, once we have a value stream of a specific thing, we can create pilot teams, we can create a list of things we want to optimize in the process, and we can continuously experiment. And this is a key thing that I just want to say. Never say, we've changed the way we work. Don't ever say that. Everyone will say no. What you always want to say is we are experimenting with a new way. And for the next 6 months, we're going to do this experiment. And maybe, if it doesn't work, we'll do something else. People are going to be much more open in terms of personal motivation to try something when they know it's not a fixed deal. It's not a marriage. It's basically just an experiment. They're going to be much more open to it. Even if they think that it's going to fail, they're still going to actually perform it. Okay? So with that, thank you very much, everybody, and be productive.